5 days after Helene first arrived here, there are still hundreds of Kentuckians without power.
But those with some of the electric co-ops that cover central Kentucky say there is a light at the end of the tunnel. WKYT's Alyssa Williams explains why.
The remnants of Hurricane Helene brought numerous damages and power outages across central Kentucky, some of which are still lingering 5 days out.
All but 1% of those who lost power have been restored. It has been a Herculean effort to get that going. However, if you're one of the 949 people, as we're speaking, in co-op territory who still don't have power, that's not good enough. And I've been on that boat before myself, in terms of being without power for a week or more.
Joe Arnold with Kentucky Electric Cooperatives says things have become a reconstruction effort rather than a restoration with the amount of damages to lines. And they approach these types of outages in a triage system.
But as far as that triage is concerned, you're going to make sure that critical infrastructure is taken care of first: hospitals, nursing homes, emergency response areas. Those are going to have to be taken care of first for everyone's safety. And from that point on, it's both a matter of the biggest chunks. If one outage is going to be able to, if the restoration of that one outage is going to be able to restore 2,000 members of our co-op, you're going to do that first before you take care of the one outage, which might be affecting a neighborhood of maybe 5 homes.
Arnold says he understands the frustrations of anyone who is still in the dark, but rest assured, crews are working to help.
The line workers, they live in the same communities that are affected here, so they're very motivated to get that job done as quickly as possible. So just know you're not forgotten. They know that you're there. You're a member too, and we care about your safety.
Alyssa Williams, WKYT.
Arnold says getting power restored as quickly as possible is their top priority, but he asks anyone still without power to remain patient, especially as crews work to get things up and running in more rural areas.